talk that I'm going to give today is called #Heroes versus Disinformation Dystopia, Left, the Right, and the Truth About Social Media Activism. And this is a talk that I've given several times this semester. Actually, I started giving it last semester, and it's changed a lot since the paper that it's based on was published in September of last year. So you're seeing the latest evolution of it as my thinking has been changed by research that's been published since the original paper has been published. Digital and social media activism has been an active research area for over 2 decades. There have been countless studies, too many to count, mainly because of the studies that are on the periphery that may or may not be considered as such, depending on who's counting. Popular and scholarly interest in this topic remains strong, and it has been even more so over the past couple of years, especially last year, with the rise of things like Black Lives Matter, anti-mask and anti-lockdown protests, and other forms of protests, much of which has played out on the internet and digital spaces. And of course, computational social science, which is my area of methodological expertise, has become integral to this, alongside more traditional methods like, surveys, experiments, ethnographies, interviews, and that sort of thing. So this talk, as I mentioned earlier, is based on an article that was published in September of last year. It's first authored by me, and a couple of colleagues helped me with that. Basically, the article looks at ideological asymmetries in terms of how the left and the right have been portrayed, both in the popular and the scholarly press. And so that is kind of the frame that I approach this general topic with, and that I discuss the 3 basic segments of the article, the first of which has to do with clicktivism and slacktivism, which are basically the same thing, and a concept with which some of you may be familiar. And then the other 2 focus more specifically on characterizations of the left and the right, respectively. And so that is sort of the general frame of the talk. And then anybody who's more interested in these topics, if you haven't done so already, should go ahead and follow up on this citation and read that. And of course, any feedback, of course, is welcome either during this presentation or afterward. You can email me. I'm happy to talk about it. Obviously, I think it's an interesting topic, so definitely happy to discuss that. So let's talk about clicktivism and slacktivism a little bit. And so for those of you who are not aware, this is the idea that online engagement substitutes for real offline engagement, or rather, one of the common arguments that is attached to clicktivism, slacktivism. Clicktivism, slacktivism itself is really just low-cost online political or civic engagement. These are things like posting under hashtags that are political in nature. It's changing your profile picture. It's just engaging digitally in one way or another in political ways. And so one argument that is often attached to this is the idea that such low-cost online engagement takes the place of real offline engagement. Our review of the literature reveals that there's almost no evidence of this. Rather, online engagement tends to support offline engagement, which means that if you are interested in a given political topic, you tend to engage with it both online and offline. And if you are not interested in a given topic, you tend to do neither. And so in some cases, there is some evidence that clicktivism or slacktivism may serve as a gateway toward more high-cost offline engagement. So, you may learn about something via a hashtag or via other social mediated content, and then you get more into it, you become more active and engage with it at a deeper level. Evidence for this is not, there's not a ton of it, but there is some, and definitely an area for future research. So one factor that we identify here is the fact that most relevant research looks at political engagement in an undifferentiated way. So, the studies will ask questions, those that are based on surveys will ask questions about things like voting, signing petitions, campaign volunteering, that kind of thing, without respect to the specific issues to which those are applied. And this research doesn't tend to explore how people's level of commitment to different issues might affect their willingness to engage in high versus low effort activism. So for example, we know that people are very often parts of issue publics where they heavily engage on issues that they are very interested in, and maybe lightly or not at all engage in issues that they are less interested in. So you might see that if people engage in an issue that is slacktivism only, then they may be more likely to, that may be something that's outside of their issue public. And then they may devote more of their political energies to things that they are more directly interested in, which would be, one or two issues that they have time to do that with for most people. And so one question that we found difficult to answer in this paper was the question of whether collectivism and slacktivism work differently for the left and the right. It turns out there's very little literature on this. And so we don't know whether this is the case. One question that we raised is this question of whether it is a more effective gateway for one than the other. We have some very, with some of the radicalization literature on the right wing indicates that that may be the case. But as far as I know, there haven't any direct comparison case study type research projects on this. If you're aware of those, I'd love to hear about them. And so consequently, this really does seem like a great area for future research, just given the relevance and the interest in slacktivism, as well as that of ideological asymmetry between left and right. So let's talk more about ideological asymmetry. It's something that I've discussed. I haven't really defined that specifically, so I'm happy to do that now. So this refers to systematic differences in left-right beliefs and behaviors. So there are a number of findings that demonstrate this. And so among other ways, conservatives trust mainstream news less, and this is mostly from the American context. Just by the way, I'm very interested in hearing how these findings may apply to European and other international contexts. Most of what I'm going to talk about today does come from the American context, that being the one that I'm most familiar with. So in the American context, conservatives trust mainstream news less. They have a stronger preference for ideological echo chambers. They share more false news, and they tolerate politicians spreading disinformation more. So these are all situations in which conservatives have a greater predilection to doing these kinds of things than people on the other side of the ideological aisle. And they're all examples of the many ideological asymmetries that we have been observing empirically, both on the academic side and on the popular side, with increasing frequency since the advent of the Trump administration in 2017. So, and then this, of course, brings us to the central dichotomy that animates this presentation, which I've called #heroes versus disinformation dystopia. Now, this particular phrasing was not something that we used in the paper, but I find that it's actually pretty effective for a presentation because it really does capture a lot of the normative trappings of what is really going on here. So to start with the first one, #heroes, right? You have the idea that #activism, as we understand it, the notion that a hashtag can sort of be a slogan or a sort of master signifier for movements, and not only movements in general, but specifically left-leaning movements. If you take a look at the image on the left side of this slide, you can see that the hashtags that are stamped on this pound sign are, without exception, left-leaning in nature. So everything from Feel the Burn, Resistance, Black Girl Magic, Black Lives Matter, No DPL, Me Too, Occupy, etc. And so the intimation here, or the subtext, not really even the subtext, it's like a text that's right there at the surface, is that the use of these hashtags is something that is viewed as exclusively or mostly a left-wing phenomenon. And also the fact that there is a note of heroism there, where the use of these hashtags is seen as normatively virtuous and something that has, that is praiseworthy in that way. Now, contrast that to what's on the right-hand side of the slide, which I term disinformation dystopia. You can see Fox News, Sean Hannity, right, InfoWars, all of which have been known at one time or another in greater or lesser proportions to spread disinformation. And the overall effect of this is the impression that disinformation is the exclusive province, or the predominantly, overwhelmingly large province of the right wing. So that is the impression that has been given, I believe, by the scholarly literature in this area, as well as in the popular view. And those two are connected because a lot of the news articles about this tend to be based on, rightly, I believe, tend to be based on the academic research. And so this is the received impression that our literature review indicated. So this is, when you think about, left versus right and hashtag activism versus disinformation and alternative media ecosystems, you have this nice 2x2 grid. And you can see this is just a demonstrative. I would definitely defend, this is not like comprehensive or a systematic review by any means, but I would certainly defend this to say that there's vastly more research on hashtag activism of the left, that would be this quadrant, and alternative media ecosystem / disinformation on the right down here, than there is on the off diagonals here, left-wing disinformation and right-leaning hashtag activism. And so the question that we're faced with is this because this is where the action is? In other words, hashtag activism is really the exclusive or predominant province of the left. Disinformation is the exclusive province or predominant province of the right, disinformation. And then there simply isn't a whole lot of this to study. Or could there be something else going on? And that's one of the questions that I'll be exploring in the coming slides. So again, these are the possibilities that I just mentioned, right? So the literature as it stands reflects true ideological divisions in online activism operating strategies. So the impression is correct. It is giving us a true view of the world, and we don't really have anything to worry about. We continue along the track that we have been. Other possibility, second possibility, is that there is insufficient research on, firstly, right-wing hashtag activism, and secondly, left-leaning disinformation that combined is generating an incomplete empirical portrayal. Or, as we scholars often like to say, the answer may be somewhere in between. And so I'll present some very preliminary evidence, primarily to support point 2, but also some evidence to support point 1. I'm very interested in hearing some reactions and bringing additional evidence that may bear on one or both of these possibilities. So before I continue, I do want to talk about, so I feel like discussions of this nature do run the risk, rather, of falling into an unfortunate connotation of false equivalence. This is why we titled our paper that, right? So I do want to say that, even though there may be, disinformation on both sides, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're equally dangerous or that the consequences are equivalent. I think it's absolutely the case that, at least in the United States context, since January 6th, I think that's very strong evidence to demonstrate that right-wing disinformation is more damaging and certainly has cost more lives than whatever is happening on the left. There certainly has been an attempt on the American right politically to blur the distinctions, to say that what happened on January 6th was the same as what happened during the Black Lives Matter protests of summer 2020. This is a narrative that I reject, and something that I think is self-evident for anybody who's not a partisan hack. But I did want to point that out and say that the fact that that disinformation may exist on both sides doesn't necessarily mean that their effects are equivalent. Now, I also think that since I began to give this presentation, when I first started giving it, I was a little bit agnostic. I felt that the evidence hadn't really come in insofar as the amount of right-wing disinformation quantity versus left-wing. I think that research that's been published since I first started giving this talk have really convinced me that in terms of volume, there does seem to be more right-wing disinformation than left-wing. And the part of what really convinced me there was these studies that were released after the 2020 election. One was by the Election Integrity Partnership called The Long Fuse: Misinformation in the 2020 Election, which really details a lot of this content. Basically, it's a book that details this in great detail, very fine detail. And then there is this other report by Cybersecurity for Democracy, which showed that far-right news and misinformation received the most engagement on Facebook, 2020. And then, of course, the very recent finding that half of American Republicans believe that it was Antifa that was mostly responsible for the violence in the Capitol on January 6th is a manifestly false narrative for which there is no evidence, which is believed by half of partisan Republicans in the states. And so this late-breaking information really has convinced me on the quantity issue. And so the main remaining question, at least as far as left-wing disinformation, has to do more with quality. What kind is it? How does it compare? And what are its effects, rather than the actual quantity, on which I think the empirical evidence is rapidly converging on a definitive answer. So let's take some evidence for possibility one, right? So this is, I suppose the previous slide fits into that as well. So we know from the empirical record that hashtag activism is a widely used and effective mode of online activism for the left. There's been tons of studies to demonstrate this. I don't think it's controversial. We also know, secondly, that the right has its own alternative media ecosystem. This is not only true in the States, we also present some information and some evidence in our paper to demonstrate that this is also true in several international locations. So this alternative media ecosystem is, firstly, disproportionately tolerant of mis and disinformation, and secondly, closely networked with ideological leaders, including Trump. These are things that we know. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no disinformation on the left, there's no hashtag activism on the right, but we do know these things about the left and the right. And those are the areas that have been very, very well studied. And so this is some older evidence that did find, again, that there was a substantial amount of fake news and disinformation sharing consumption on the right. And so this was some of the preliminary evidence that came from prior to the Trump administration. And, before, my sort of response to this was, okay, we have all this information, but it came from before Trump was elected. Maybe Trump being elected actually changed something. Maybe that was, maybe there was more incentive for the left to engage in disinformation to fight Trump. But it seems that with the recent evidence that seems to not be the case. But certainly, it is interesting and worth noting that the evidence from before the 2016 election certainly seems to converge with the very recent evidence emerging from after the 2020 election. So I want to just talk theoretically for a moment. I have a couple of examples from books that address these questions and some of the theoretical roadblocks they tend to throw up that make this kind of analysis a little bit more difficult than it has to be. So this book that I'm showing you is one that I think is actually a really great book, and I'm really only going to quibble with one point in it. I think this book is absolutely worth reading. Jackson, Bailey, and Wells, a book that really brings together critical theory as well as computational and data science analysis in a really innovative way. A very cool book overall. But I do want to quibble with this one point that they make, this idea that they identify and connect hashtag activism with specific ideological commitments on the left, right? So identity politics that advocate for social change, identity redefinition, and political inclusion. So to me, this actually bakes in the definition of a tactic, which is hashtag activism, with a specific set of ideological commitments. And I think that's not a great idea. If hashtag activism is a tactic, it needs to be allowed to be adopted by any ideology, right? So in other words, we have to allow for the possibility that right-leaning people can do the same things that left-leaning people can do, and to analyze it in that way, rather than saying, well, hashtag activism has to have some element of identity-sensitive left-leaning commitments there. And so I'm an advocate for decoupling these ideas and allowing the hashtag activism to be something that anyone can engage with. And so here's another illustrative case. This is from Network Propaganda, a book that some of you may be familiar with, came out in 2018. And so here we see this notion that a population with high trust in bias-confirming news and high distrust in bias-disconfirming professional norms-driven media will be more vulnerable to disinformation campaigns than a population that has higher trust in professional journalism on average, but lower trust in a given media outlet. So they don't actually have to come out and say what they're talking about. I mean, obviously in the surrounding text they do this, but it's clear that they're referring to conservatives, people on the right, and the fact that they are more vulnerable to disinformation and misinformation, specifically because they don't trust biased, disconfirming news. But again, I think in many ways, this is something that makes it a little bit more difficult to figure out and understand how disinformation and misinformation plays out on the left because of the emphasis on the news media and news outlets, as I'll demonstrate on the next slide. Because network propaganda really does not give a whole lot of examples of left-leaning disinformation, misinformation. The one example they do give, or one of the major examples they give, is a case of disinformation that emerged over the summer of 2016, which was that Trump was somehow involved in a case of child rape. And so the basic argument that they give is that such claims are less relevant because they are largely ignored by mainstream news outlets, which is not the case for right-wing media. The counterpoint that I'm making is that disinformation may have other effects that are unrelated to mainstream news engagement, right? This is 2021. We have alternative information distribution channels. And so we can't just say that because mainstream news is not engaging with this, then therefore it is not relevant for the left. Now, obviously, I think there is something to the fact that, yes, left-wingers do tend to get most of their information from traditional news sources, but I don't think that completely invalidates disinformation from a left-leaning perspective. And let me present some evidence of that. So here's an example. So this is the exact same disinformation claim that was released in the summer of 2016, also resurfaced during the summer of 2020 through Anonymous, the hacktivist collective, which on May 31st, 2020, released a cache of documents purporting to prove that Trump was involved in child sex trafficking. This was almost entirely ignored by mainstream media sites, as Benkler et al. Would have predicted. But the story picked up 1.1 million retweets within 3 to 4 days. I think this is quite remarkable. And there's a lot we don't know about this because we don't know who's sharing the content, how it fits in with the rest of their media diets, what are the similarities and differences in right-wing disinformation sharing. These are extremely important questions in this area of research that are really understudied here. I did some very preliminary analysis of this, and this is just a super descriptive look at some of the top tweeters on this topic containing Anonymous and Trump between May 31st and June 3rd. The vast majority of the usernames here are not especially politically engaged. Actually, sort of qualitatively went back through their Twitter feeds, and it turns out that You Are Non-Central is really the only political one. That was the number one most retweeted account for this. The rest of them are mostly entertainment focused. They focus a lot on K-pop and anime and a lot of other topics. And so one question that emerges is that if these Twitter accounts are not engaging with politics heavily, could it be the case that these kinds of disclosures are disproportionately influential on them because they aren't engaging with a lot of different political sources that could perhaps challenge those? So that's an open question. I raise that just for sort of future research purposes, and because it sort of demonstrates a good case of probable left-wing disinformation that is of somewhat recent vintage. Here's another one. This is a bit older one. This one comes from September 2016, right before the 2016 election. It's from BuzzFeed, the news outlet. And what they did was they looked at 3 hyper-partisan left-wing outlets on Facebook, 3 hyper-partisan right-wing outlets on Facebook, and they actually classified the posts into mostly false, mix of true or false, mostly true, no factual content. And so what they found, and you also note that the y-axes are very different, tops out of 5,000 for the right, tops out of 20,000 for the left. Seems like some of these left-wing hyper-partisan outlets are actually producing a fair amount of mis and disinformation if you look at those red bars. And so this was actually very surprising to me. If you look at the headline of this article, it actually doesn't highlight this. But the large amount of mostly false content, even partly false content on these left-wing hyper-partisan pages really, I think, begs for additional analysis, trying to figure out what's going on there, what is the nature of it, what are the suggestions that are going on there. And so the article did a little bit of this analysis, but I think that it really is worth taking up by rigorous researchers who can really do this right and figure out what's going on here. Here's another example. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Seth Abramson. He's an American who does a lot of very deep Twitter threads and has really become quite popular among the resistance left in the United States during the Trump administration. And there was an article that came out in the Columbia Journalism Review about a month ago in which he it was a profile of him. And the profile did not explicitly accuse him of disinformation, but it did note that the theories that he strung together often turned out to be mistaken. Now, I personally find that to be what I would refer to as an overly charitable interpretation of the situation, because in my book, if you are repeatedly mistaken on topics of political importance, then to me, what that says is that you're not taking seriously the critiques of your method. And that sort of, I think, is too close for comfort to a reckless disregard for the truth, right? So either you don't know or you don't care what you're saying is true or false. And that, to me, is a little bit too close to mis and disinformation. And so this is a model that may produce something that is very much and very similar to disinformation on the left that may be ignored by existing research, and certainly is one that is worth exploring a bit further. And so there's little doubt there's at least some of this out there. We don't know nearly as much about it as we do right-wing disinformation. The evidence presented here invites more rigorous work going forward. And really critically, I really do want to underscore this, even null results are valuable. So you search for it, you don't find it. Very important to know that for reasons that I'll get into in a little bit. Here's just a little preview of something I'm working on that might help. And so this is something I call like a filter map. And the idea behind this is it is a personalized map of your information environment, in this case, Twitter, that maps your information sources according to two axes. The left-right axis is ideology. Obviously, that means what you think it means. Going over to the left or the right based on scaling mechanisms. You can use whatever scaling mechanism you want. There are a bunch of good ones. And then you have the vertical axis, which is information credibility. If you're high credibility, you're mostly publishing truthful content. If you're low credibility, that means you're probably a disinformation or misinformation purveyor. So the idea here is to figure out and present people with information that can help them understand where their information's sources fall on this map. And the idea here is if you want to have diversity ideologically in your information feed, you want to remain above that x-axis so that you're mostly getting truthful content, and you don't want to be deceived even if things are on your same ideological side. If it's below the x-axis, that means you're getting false content. So here is one potential way of helping that. Also, the size of the dot indicates the prominence of the source in your information feed. So this is just something I'm working on for the future that I think has some relevance, and I wanted to be able to present it to see what people think about that. So let me talk about hashtag activism on the right briefly. So if it's a set of tactics, it should theoretically be applicable to individuals outside the left, as I mentioned earlier. There's little evidence or research on how often this is attempted on the right, let alone success rates. There is anecdotal evidence that suggests that hashtag activism does exist to some degree on the right. We'll discuss that. So some of you may be familiar with this. These are some old boycott hashtags from the Trump administration. Just recently, there are some newer ones. There was a voter restrictive and repressive voting law that was recently passed in the state of Georgia in the United States. And there have been boycotts of some of the corporations that have spoke out against those. So Major League Baseball and Delta Airlines are a couple of those. And so these boycott campaigns very much resemble the hashtag activism that we see on the left, but there's been almost no research on them, very little, although there have been a few studies that have sort of gotten sort of the edges, the periphery of this phenomenon. So they seem to at least, to mimic the left-wing hashtag activism playbook, at least at first glance. We should be asking about this. What are the similarities and differences? Who's behind the hashtags? What are the effects? What is the news media, political elite response, et cetera? So there is a little bit of existing research that sort of touches on this. So there's a study of the Donald that came out a couple of years ago that looked at it as a political trolling community that sort of briefly mentioned hashtag activism-like activities, including boycott Netflix and draft our daughters. There was a study that came out in a public relations journal last year that examined boycott Starbucks and boycott Budweiser. But that was really from a corporate social responsibility perspective and not from a political perspective. And so I do think that there needs to be more conceptualization of these phenomena within specifically political conceptual frameworks, and specifically within the hashtag activism umbrella. So at least if you're not going to call it hashtag activism, you should at least, say what it is and conceptualize it in relation to that. So what do we do? So there's ample evidence that left-wing disinformation and right-wing hashtag activism are understudied at best. We must rectify this to gain a more complete picture of the ideological asymmetries that characterize online activism. So this is a false balance, right? So if it turns out that disinformation is more predominantly on the right, and I think there is strong evidence of that, but I think we have to do the work to find out, especially finding out those differences in terms of quality rather than quantity, where the quantity question, I think, is getting close to settled at this point. I do find that the normative implications of the hashtag heroes disinformation dystopia divide strongly recommend that we firm up the empirical foundations on this as much as possible. So, it becomes a little bit uncomfortable for me, when I have to sort of argue that all of the really bad stuff in our information environment is mostly on the other side, because people, I think, can rightly point out that that's a self-serving argument, and it may very well be. And if there's strong empirical foundations for that, I'm okay with that, but I'm not okay with basically sort of making that accusation without a very strong empirical framework. And one of the reasons for that is the self-serving nature, given my own ideological position. So I'm wary of that when I'm sort of talking about this in the public sphere. And so, yeah, I'm going to end there. There is a citation to our paper. Happy to discuss this. Very interested to hear what your reactions on this are.